So I ran into an issue working on the second option, which is add category, where when I would enter the category name and description, it would spit out an error that I Googled. Context has changed since the database was created. And what it recommended that I do was visit a Microsoft page on code first migration, which wasn't very helpful. So I thought I'd ask you.
Yeah, no, it's actually a very good question. So, and the reason is just at its very basic is because when we run the very first time, when we run that our program, what we don't see is happening is there's actually a migration to the database, and a migration is really just something that migrates the data and the model and the schema and everything over to the database. Okay, so right now we know that inside of our context, so if we were to look inside of our models folder here and inside of this context, we see that we've got 3 tables effectively, or 3 models really in this case, that are part of our context, right? And we can see products, categories, suppliers, those are all here. Okay, products, categories, suppliers. And these here, these definitions, so if we look at the columns on categories, for instance, we can see that these things here are defined based upon what we put in here. So category ID, category name, and description are all here. Well, the reason that category name is listed, notice it says not null, is because it's required. All right. Now, one thing we didn't specify. Go ahead. Nope. Go ahead.
You mentioned the option to make a variable null by adding a question mark at the end of the data type. Right. Yeah, for category ID that wouldn't work because it's the primary key. But I noticed the description is null, so you would probably drop
because it's a string. Yep.
Yeah, at the end of the string. So what I actually did not notice was
a string. You're never going to do this because a string is already nullable.
Okay, I see. Just by its nature as a data type.
Right, exactly. So did you have a question, follow-up question on that though?
No, I didn't. I just thought I'd interject.
Sure, yeah, no. So one thing we might want to do, for instance, is you notice that like description right now is defined as an nvarchar max, right? And it's really because we hadn't defined any lengths to it, but we do have, here's one annotation that we could add. We can say, what is the maximum length allowed inside of that property? We could say, well, you know what, we only want a maximum of 500 characters or something inside of that, right?
Yeah, so you can't
now
descriptions.
Right, so we can't write a book, right? And we might want to do this for a lot of reasons. It's not really important, but the point is that simply adding this specific max length property, this annotation, to this field inside of our model, we're really asking the database to change. We're saying inside of our category model here, we want description to no longer be this nvarchar max. We want it to be nvarchar 500. Okay, so if I try to run this now, or I'll just build it, I'm probably going to get an error, and I think this is probably going to be the same error that you got.
Oh,
let's see. It succeeded. Let me try to run it.
I also didn't have any errors when this was coming up.
Okay. So I am just going to. Waiting for it to run. I'm going to quick share my screen here. I'm going to run it. And I'm going to say display categories. It might be crashing here on me. We'll see what happens.
And the option 1 code is already written for me as far as I can tell.
Yeah, it is. Yep. Okay, so we did see it, but unfortunately it popped up. Screen sharing is closed. What happened there? There we go. Let's go back. Okay. Unfortunately, we saw the error, but where did it go? I'm going to do debug again with start without debugging, just so we can see the message next time, because it popped up and went away too fast, so we didn't get a chance to see it. So let me do this one more time. I'm gonna come back in, do a new share. Okay, and I'm gonna do a display categories one more time and watch what happens here. We should see the very similar message that you saw last time.
Yeah.
Okay, does that look familiar to you?
That's
okay.
the same message. Yeah.
Perfect. So what this is really telling us is that something, right? We know what we changed. We changed this specific model, and it's saying the model backing that specific context. So we know this model is inside of our context. It's changed since the database was created. So the message itself is pretty clear. It's just the question is like, well, what do we do about it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to close this real quick, and I got to do a share again, because every time that window goes away, it wants to share again. Okay. All right. So what happened here, though, really is we got a couple of things that we could do. One is sort of the nuclear approach, and the other one that I want to show you tonight is a little bit more finessed. Okay. So one thing we didn't really talk about is this migration history table here. This migration history table, if I come in and I'm going to say view data. Okay. So we'll take a look at this.
I actually did that when I was trying to troubleshoot it myself, and it just contains a CS file.
Okay. Well, it contains, what this is really the details about the thing, what has run as part of the actual migration. Okay, so like I said, we don't see the migrations, but these migrations are actually getting created in the background. So whenever you run the database the very first time, notice this thing here is called initial create. That's sort of the default message. If we don't supply a name for our specific database migration name, the migration ID in this case, this is what it gets called. We can give it a name when we run it manually, but this is what it's going to show up as if you don't give it a name. Okay, and then it's telling us what is the context, and then it's got some other data here that we don't really care about right now, but it's really tracking the migrations that have run. Okay, so what it sees right now is that there is an initial create migration that has run, and it does not see any other migrations inside of our code that are waiting to be run. Okay, so there's two different errors we could get. The one we've seen where it says, hey, something's changed, and therefore I can't do what I need to do because I don't have any changes pending to the database to tell me what to do. All I can tell you is that it's changed, but I don't know what changed. Okay. The other error we could see is if we had migrations enabled, which we'll turn it on here in a second, I'll show what that means. But if we had migrations enabled, it would say, hey, there is a pending migration waiting to be run against your database. You need to run that migration before I can do anything. Okay. So the reason we're getting the specific error we're seeing is because migrations are not enabled right now.
Okay.
Right? Does that make sense? Okay. So to see how this works, we actually have a tool here, this package manager console. This is typically where you run these commands. Yeah, we've played with this before with like NuGet and things like that. But really what we want to do here is we want to enable migrations, okay? And it's really as easy as saying enable migrations. So if I hit that, hopefully this works. Sometimes we get goofy PowerShell problems if we don't have all the packages installed properly, but crossing my fingers, let's see. Okay. Is there an existing database? It's double checking because we didn't, and the reason it's doing this is because we didn't. Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I got that as well.
Okay, this is good. So it's saying that there is a migration that already ran that corresponds to this database, which we know. And in this case, it's saying like, hey, you know what? If we come over here, it's probably, we're going to see there is right here. So here is the migrations that already ran, okay?
Okay.
So it created this for us, which is really nice. If we open this thing up, we'll see that this right here should be defined. Let's see. I want to make sure. Yep. So this is the actual migration that ran the very first time. All right. And you can see here's description. There's no definitions for it. Here's those null to false. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. There's a whole bunch of create table commands. Okay, this should look sort of familiar. It should match actually what's in the database currently. Primary keys, all this kind of good stuff. Okay. Now, there's a couple of things inside of this specific create, and notice this name here matches the name of that specific migration. Okay, so there's always going to be two methods. Okay, one up and one down. The up, like you can see, comes in, creates all the tables. If we take a look at the down is actually doing the reverse. So the reason they exist is because in the case of, think about like if this was a code base, right? We have our repository out on GitHub and we've got a bunch of people that are working on it. Well, there's going to be a scenario sometimes where somebody commits something to the code base and it breaks everything and you want to roll that back. Well, the great thing is that this code first migration also has the same ability to roll things back. And in order to roll it back, you execute a specific command and it runs the things that are in the down method, okay? And then it goes through and it drops and does all the stuff here that it wants to do, okay? So this is all we need. This is all set and ready to go. We can extend this and do some play around and maybe you'll learn about that in .NET Web, but the idea is that this is it. This is all we care about, is that there's an up and a down. So if we run our code now though, let's see what happens. So we've got migrations enabled, but I want to see if the message changed. So let's take a look. Let me go and do a share again here. Share. Say display categories again, and let's see if we get a different message.
Yep.
Nope, same message. Okay, I was hoping we'd see a different message. All right, but the point is we're still getting an error. Okay, because we haven't modified the database yet. Even though we've enabled migrations, there's nothing that we've done. We haven't actually told it to go out and find the changes. So what we need to do now is share our screen again. Okay. And what we need to do though now is come in and tell it, hey, I have a new migration. I want you to do something. And what we can do is this. So inside of our console, I'm going to say add migration. I think I have that right, add migration. And we can give it a project name. So we can say, in this case, in our category, we added a description. So it's always a good idea to have sort of a descriptive message to tell you what change you made. So I might want to say, I don't know, modified category description length, something, I don't know, whatever, right? But the idea is that you want to be able to look at your specific migration in your migration folder and know what it is that was changed, okay? So I'm going to add a migration. Let me run this. And what we'll see is we should see a new folder, a new file appear in our migrations folder here. And it will open up that file once it gets generated. So what it's doing right now is it's going out looking at the database. Oh, there we go. And it's trying to figure out what changes were made. There we go.
There it goes.
Now, and notice what it told me. Now, when it runs this migration, it's going to alter the column description and set the max length to 500. And then when it rolls it back, it's going to take off that. It's not going to apply that max length to it anymore. Okay. So as of this point, if we look at the database, though, in this here, we can. I'll do a view data again here. Let's just refresh this, make sure. So we can see that this still is the only one that's run, okay? And if we were to look at this here, we can refresh this. We can see that the specific column here still hasn't changed. It's still varchar max, okay? So all we've done so far is generated the code. That's really all this command does. This enable migration turned it on, and then add migration went this route, okay? So before I take the very next step, though, one thing I would maybe recommend is this is a perfectly fine way to do it, all right? But you might want to enable migrations and then set up, because imagine that you are working with a big group, and I know, Abby, you've come across this, but you might want to make sure you have a snapshot of your specific database before changes are made, okay? And you want to make sure that people are coming along and doing this, because you know what's going to happen is that somebody's going to make a whole bunch of changes and then they're going to forget to run the migration. So therefore you're going to pull the code down and none of your code's going to work, okay? So it's a good idea to have migrations enabled if you're working in a group. And I'm sure you can see why, because that way the database changes are tracked as well as the code changes, okay? So don't wait until you do a whole bunch of work on your database and then decide, oh shoot, I got to go ahead and enable migrations. Do that ahead of time, especially in large group projects. Okay.
Thanks, Mark.
All right. Yep. So all that said, how do we execute this? It's really pretty simple. There's actually a command called update database.
I've tried that one before and gotten red letters.
All right, let's see what happens. See if it works. So we should see, it should come up and say that it's applying the specific migration. This modified, whatever I called this guy. There we go. So applying the explicit migration. So let's take a look. So if we refresh this, we should see now that the specific migration history should contain, yep, there it is. Sorry, I don't know why it's so moved up, but there you go. There's the new one that ran. And if we were to take a look here, we should hopefully see, if I refresh this, refresh, and look at the columns, there we go.
Awesome,
okay.
Cool.
And now if I run my program, let me change my view here real quick. There we go. If I run this, I shouldn't see, it shouldn't crash at this point anymore. One thing, there you go. Okay, nothing in the table, but it didn't crash. Okay.
So
one thing, if I just finish up the thought here. So one thing I want to say that does happen sometimes is if you're doing these sort of migrations of moving code in and out, you're rolling code forward, you're rolling code back. If you have data in your database, remember that all of the things that run here, they are destructive commands. Okay, so imagine that you decided that you didn't have any restrictions on the code or the data in your database, and then you decided to shorten it. That is destructive, okay? And if this is the reverse, if you try to roll back and maybe you went from 500 to saying, I don't care, or maybe even 1,000, and you try to reduce that, the nice thing is that the Entity Framework tools here will warn you. It's going to say, hey, we're going to potentially truncate data, so therefore we're not going to run the rollback. We're not going to allow you to shorten it beyond a point where there's already data in the table. You're going to delete some of the data. Okay, so I want you to be confident in the fact that the data operations that this thing runs is not going to be destructive. You're not going to have to worry about blowing away data on accident. Okay.
Did I have any questions? No, I don't. I think now that I have that, I'm probably good for the time being.
Okay, yeah, and this is super useful. And so I mentioned there is a nuclear option. What is the nuclear option? Well, the nuclear option is coming in and just saying, you know what, in my specific context, in my database schema, come in, select all of these, right click, choose delete.
Well, yeah, that is nuclear, yeah.
Yep, and that will actually honestly take care of it, because if you don't have migrations enabled, there's no option, because you're just going to keep hitting that error over and over and over. You have no option to actually modify the database if it already exists, right? And because there's sort of that hidden migration history entry, that's that initial create that's already in there, it's never going to run that update or changes to the database, because it thinks it already ran. It says, well, I already ran the initial create. And we can see it here now because we enabled migrations, but normally we don't even see this. But just know that's what's holding everything up. So you really have to say, delete the migration history table for sure, so it runs again. But then additionally, if you've made changes, you're going to want to delete at least the table that you made changes to. I don't know what would happen. I think, let's say we know that we only made changes to the category table, and we said, all right, you know what, I'm going to force it by deleting the migration history and deleting the categories table, and then I'm going to try to run everything again. I think what will happen is the context is going to it's going to complain. It's going to say, I can't create a brand new table called products or suppliers because it already exists in the database, and it's going to crash. It's going to bomb on you. So you really have no option except for to just delete everything.
Yep, that's pretty nuclear.
Yeah. So obviously the enable migrations is a little cleaner, a little more slick, and I recommend that actually because you can track all the changes you made, and you can roll things forward, roll things back. And one of the nice things too is I'm not sure if you'll learn this in .NET Web, depends on the instructor, but one thing you can do is notice that this configuration.cs, it's actually inheriting. I'm sorry, these initial create, the actual migration files that got created, they're inheriting from something. You can certainly you can take all of these commands and do anything we want with them. They don't have to be these create tables and stuff, because what happens if you go in and you want to insert data or something, right? You can certainly create an empty migration. We can come in and say add migration, and let's call it insert data, I don't know, something like that, right? Well, right now it says, I see that there are not any changes to the database because we didn't make any changes yet, right? So it's going out, it's scanning, it's looking to see, did you make any changes? And it says, you know what? Let's take a look. It's going to come up here. You'll see here in a second, this insert data will get created.
But is it just not going to have any methods?
Yep. And so here you go. There's insert data, up and down or empty. See that? So you can come in here and do anything you want, any of those commands. So you'd have to do a little research and find out, like, here's an alter column, you know, here's a create table. But I think it's SQL. I forget now. It's been a while, but you can come in here and execute SQL statements.
SQL Server to populate the tables before I started messing.
Yeah. So you can do this. You can create an SQL string in here and execute some statements, or you can do SQL file. That's another one too. You can take a file, and maybe that file contains all of your insert statements. Hey, we happen to have a file with a whole bunch of insert statements in it. That might work for you. So you have a number of options. So if that's something you wanted to do, as opposed to, and I've considered doing this in the past where I would provide this migration to the students with all those insert statements built right into the migration itself. But the problem is you can see that this idea of migrations is a little more advanced. You know, it's not hard, you know, once you see how it works, but you can see how there would be some value in creating a new insert data migration for yourself that would just insert all those things into the database, right?
Got it.
Now, yeah. Here's one other thing you can do. Something we do at my company is we have extended this. We don't call it DB migration. We have another class that we created, and it goes out and it looks at the specific file because, and this is sort of a bonus, but what you could do is you can create a new folder here, for instance, and call it something, and all of your insert statements. So I'm just going to add a quick text file here. New item. Give me 1 second. Just create a text file here just for the heck of it. Come on. And we'll call it like insert configurations or something like that. Okay. And I'm going to call it development.sql. Okay. So inside of this specific file, I could have a whole bunch of insert statements. Insert into configurations, you know.
Oh yeah, it's even like the
values
for UI.
Right. And then this way, your specific method could, whatever you write to extend this inside of your insert data, it could actually look for that specific, oh, it's development. I want to insert specific things into development. Maybe I want to create another one called test or training or production, right? And then that way, whenever this thing happens to execute, it knows which specific environment. I'm getting way outside of the scope, but I just want to give you something to think about, okay? So there's a lot of options you have here by using this automatic migration tool, all right? So we saw really basically how it could run. It's just a couple of commands. There's nothing super sophisticated about it. You just enable it, and then you add a migration, and we saw that it can be something that exists, right? So it knew that there were some changes, or if there aren't any changes, it just creates an empty one, right? So it's pretty basic. And then when you do the update database command, it will go out and update it. One note before I move on, you cannot have multiple things pending, all right? So I couldn't create a whole bunch of migrations. In fact, if I were to try to create another migration that's not empty, it would tell me you cannot do that because there are pending migrations. They may have changed that. Take that with a grain of salt, do your own testing, but in the past, you could not have multiple migrations pending at the same time. It wanted to apply them. I'm sorry?
It just seems like such a horrible idea to stack all those migration files on each other and then try to update.
Yeah, it's not a great idea. So you take that with a grain of salt. You might want to verify, but I agree with you. It's a bad idea to have a whole bunch of stuff pending. But anyways, yeah. So you can so feel free to play with this as much as you want. You can by playing around with that SQL file, and we already have done a lot working with files. You know about the path it's in the bin debug, or whether or not it's in data. How do you reference this specific directory? All sorts of things. So you can certainly reference a specific file in this specific location. We played around with that quite a bit. So, but feel free. Hey, grab those files. The populate and I forget what I called them all. Populate Northwind or something like that. It's in the module. You'll see it out there.
Yeah, there's
feel free to dump those in there. Yeah.
That covers the 3 tables we've been playing with tonight.
Yep.
And then there's one that I think populates the whole database with every connection and all the tables. So it contains table objects that we don't use right now.
Yeah. So feel free to go out there and grab those.
Thanks, Mark. That was really helpful.